I am currently the Director of ESG Reporting and Compliance at SBM Management Services. Right now, my role kind of sits at the intersection of environmental social governance, strategy, and measurable business impact. I have experience in public, nonprofit, and education, as well as private sectors. And throughout my career, I focused on sustainability in business. I focus mostly on trying to find practical ways to continually improve ESG strategies from an enterprise perspective, and in a way that supports both risk management and value creation. Off the clock, I'm also a reserve firefighter that supports Orange County, California, and also outside of Orange County. And I use that in a way to kind of connect my real world experience in the business and sustainability field and apply it kind of in a teamwork and in a fire perspective to kind of see how resilient communities are built. So with that, I'm going to begin a little bit of our presentation. So today we're going to focus on waste generation and Scope 3 emissions. And we are going to do that first by, this is a little bit about us. And when we send out the slides, you'll get a little bit more information about both Sue and I. But as we focus a little bit on today's topic, one of the things that I want to start with is environmental impacts. So we know the environmental impacts of waste. We know that landfills have limited life expectancy. All landfills will fail. This is a well-known fact. Everything from the liners that line landfills to leachate capture systems. Leachate is the effluent or the fluid that leaks from landfills. Those capture systems, those eventually are going to fail as well. There's risks associated with all of these failures. Waste pollutes waterways, oceans, and fresh body resources. We know microplastics are prevalent in the environment. We know that microplastics are broken down over time. They enter the environment like this picture shows, but they also enter our bodies. We've had multiple studies show that microplastics are prevalent in our bodies. We also have a single-use lifestyle. It's not just in wealthy countries and developed countries anymore. Single-use lifestyle has increased to all countries. This idea of I use it once and I throw it away seems to be pretty commonplace now. This approach to buy it once, use it once, throw it away has led to increased resource depletion. And we're now seeing the impacts of that. We're fighting over resources, we're fighting over land. We're opening up more protected lands to access more resources. And this will continue to happen as we start to drain the earth of finite resources and continue to lead a very disposable life. We also know that the act of disposing of waste generation itself, this generates greenhouse gas emissions. So every time we throw something away, there's greenhouse gas emissions that contributed to that. So what we want to focus on here today is there's kind of two sides to greenhouse gas emissions associated with waste. There's the life cycle of a product, and that life cycle produces greenhouse gas emissions. So life cycle of a product or a service, even it generates greenhouse gas emissions. But there's also the end result of when we dispose of something that also creates greenhouse gas emissions. It's one of the reasons it's so important that we take a look at every decision throughout the value chain, from the moment we decide we're going to create a product or service, and design it, to the moment we are a consumer purchases this product or service and it's disposed of. We want to think about waste, materials, and greenhouse gas emissions. We want to look at the holistic big picture. It's essential that we start to do that. This is one of the biggest gaps we have. Instead, we've just been producing for the sake of producing and solving for the problem of what we can get quickly and cheap. So as we start to take a look at these things, we want to first understand the basics of greenhouse gas emissions accounting. And in greenhouse gas emissions accounting, there are three scopes. They're very creatively named. There's scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions. This is my favorite image from the US EPA. And it covers pretty clearly exactly what these things are. So we have scope 1, which is direct emissions, scope 2, which is indirect emissions, and then scope 3, which is also indirect emissions. What's important to remember here is that scope 1 is direct emissions from things like your company's facilities that are owned, company-owned vehicles. Scope 2 is indirect emissions, but it's from things like purchased electricity or steam heat or any cooling for your own company use. And you'll see a lot of companies, they have net zero goals or emissions reduction goals associated with scope 1 and scope 2 typically. That's the strongest one you'll see most companies pursuing. And the reason for that is because they can control those emissions much easier than scope 3. That's because in scope 3, there are 15 categories or activities that fall into scope 3. There's upstream activities and downstream activities. And a lot of pieces and parts are associated with all 15 of these categories. The tricky part here is that a company has to influence a lot of moving parts and complex systems to be able to start to reduce scope 3. And scope 3 is always going to be the biggest influencer of greenhouse gas emissions for a majority of companies in the world. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is our kind of guiding framework that we use globally that determines which gases are considered greenhouse gases and contribute warming factors. And those are the ones that we basically count, if you will. And that's what we are trying to assess here based on these three scopes. The ones we're going to focus on today are a singular upstream activity and a singular downstream activity focused on waste. So that's waste generated in operations, and that is then end of life treatment of sold products. Both of these fall in scope 3. So what does that mean? When we take a look at these items, we want to make sure that we're looking at different solutions. Actually, I'm going to go back real quick. So one of the things I want to make sure I focus on is the difference between waste generated in operations and end-of-life treatment of sold products. The reason this is super important is because there is a clear differentiation between these two. Waste generated in operations is greenhouse gas emissions from the treatment and disposal of waste generated by a company's own operations. So this is when waste treatment occurs off-site by a third party, like a waste hauler or a recycler. It's for stuff like wastewater, food waste, any recyclables. It also can be for packaging or office waste, general office waste. It can be for construction and demolition. It can even include hazardous waste. It also includes the treatment and disposal, quote, pathways that we like to say. So are you landfilling that waste? Are you recycling it? Are you composting it? Are you sending it waste to energy? But it does not include any facilities owned or operated by the company, because that would be scope 1 or scope 2. So for example, if I own or operate a waste to energy facility, I would not count that as waste generated in operations because I own and operate the facility, so that would fall in my scope 1 or scope 2 emissions. It also doesn't include waste from sold products after customer use. So the customer used the product, we don't account for that in this specific category. It doesn't include emissions from transporting waste off-site, so not associated with the transportation of that waste. And it doesn't include any waste generated upstream in the supply chain for that product. For end-of-life treatment of sold products on the downstream of scope 3 indirect emissions, We want to take a look at waste disposal and treatment associated with sold products and their packaging, which is an important piece. So that's, again, landfilling, incineration, composting, recycling. It also includes wastewater treatment, and this one can include reuse and refurbishment. So we want to know one of the important pieces of this one is if a company were to sell an intermediate product, so a component of a product, um, and that component is sold in a larger product, that company does not have to account for the end of life treatment of the whole product it's a piece of. It only has to account for the specific product itself. Hopefully that makes sense. This specific category does not include emissions from manufacturing or using the product. It doesn't include any transportation or distribution or processing after the product's been sold, or any waste generated as a byproduct of the sale of the product. And this is a big hotspot because right now there's companies that manufacture packaging, plastics, or difficult to recycle materials, or hard to recycle materials, or electronics, batteries, chemicals, durable goods. These products are a focus of extended producer responsibility bills, and those are trying to target the end of life treatment of sold products because they have to find an outlet for these materials. And that's where this is a pretty big hotspot. You'll probably see this being influenced a little bit more from both a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, but also from a waste treatment perspective. We also got a question about embodied carbon, and I want to be pretty clear about this. So embodied carbon is typically associated with a product or material's greenhouse gas emissions from its entire life cycle from before it's used. So you'll see this a lot in stuff like construction and housing materials. It's not impactful to waste categories necessarily, but embodied carbon is becoming a hot button topic because it has to do with a lot of legislation coming out of the European Union. So stuff like product carbon footprints, environmental product declarations, life cycle assessments. These are certifications that are being required by some governments overseas to require companies who manufacture products and services and offer services to assess, know, understand, and measure the entire life cycle emissions of their products and or services. And it's for key category products. So services is starting to come to the table a little bit more, but it's not a prominent thing just yet. For embodied carbon, it usually falls under like scope 3 category 1, which is purchased goods and services, or maybe category 2, which is capital goods. That's about where you'll see that one. So I just wanted to be clear on what embodied carbon is.
Don't generate it in the first place. So we don't want to generate waste in the first place. If we can avoid generating things and generating byproducts of waste, that's the key here. So sustainability overall, in whatever way we want to think about it, sustainability is just inefficiencies in business. So if we have waste, it means we're producing something inefficiently. We should have zero waste. And so, really, we should be preventing and seeking ways to prevent waste creation in the first place. But the next should be to ensure that there's a product material that can be reused and infinitely reused, or that a product, when we take a look at its life cycle, really is forever and ever to be used over and over again. So I don't know if anyone's on Reddit or anything like that, but there's different subreddits and threads online that talk about buy it for life things. So things that have been passed down through generations where families continue to use that product. That's how we need to be thinking about things, is this idea of I want to be able to buy this product, invest money in it, and then have it last forever. This idea of single use and dispose it and buy new is really unfortunate. So we want to create a market shift where we have products that are reliable, they are built of lasting materials, they have smaller footprints overall, and they're prepared for reuse infinitely, right? That's that idea of zero waste, and that's that idea of circularity. That's where it comes into play. The other idea here is regenerative options. So there's a lot of kind of debate out there that, you know, if we can't build products and we can't build products that can be reused, and consumers still want products that can be disposed of and are single use. We're unwilling. We want to keep, we want to keep going to work every day and buy and eat off paper plates, and we're unwilling to change that attitude as a society. Then we need to start to look at regenerative options. And this is a hot button topic for a lot of waste haulers and a lot of waste experts. And really, the reason is that we don't have systems in place in on a commercial scale to be able to handle some regenerative options of bio-based products, right? But I think the important thing associated with this is that bio-based products have smaller footprints associated with greenhouse gas emissions. And given the right environment and the right infrastructure, they are capable of breaking down to nothing. So we need to take a look at things like made from natural environments and take a look at options associated with biomimicry. So let's take a look at things made from mushrooms. Let's take a look at things made from natural materials, and see if we can refine those processes so that we have nothing left behind, and then test them and then start to influence the market to adopt those things. That's really how we influence innovation and change. And that will help us bring about some positive changes, because really we're against the clock. What's going to happen first? Are we going to run out of space for landfilling things and disposing of our trash? Or are we going to run up against some horrible, drastic climate issues? So really that's where we have an option of trying to influence things, trialing things, testing things, providing honest feedback, and encouraging innovation. Finally, really, after the waste is produced, there's several types of outlets that can be specialized. And this is where SBM is an absolute subject matter expert. There are recovery outlets for hard to recycle materials that can take those hard to recycle materials, provide an outlet for them that they can be recovered. This is always going to be better than landfilling or incinerating or just getting rid of them. Just because it's out of sight doesn't necessarily mean it should be out of mind. There are solutions out there where, given the correct amount of material, a solution can hopefully be found for a majority of products out there. It's still not the best. Things like recycling really recycling are energy intensive processes. So you are going to have some level of greenhouse gas emissions associated with it. So at the end of the day, prevention is always the best. We can move on, Sue. All right. So when we take a look at how we want to report these things, this is where it gets a little bit confusing from a greenhouse gas emissions reporting perspective, because we have, again, the production of products and then the treatment of products, because there's two sides to reporting. Both of these sides generate greenhouse gas emissions, but how we report on them is different. For production, those emissions came from making that thing, making that good or that product. And when we throw that item away, right? So as a company, or as a company, manufacturer, whatever it is, you spend all that energy, resources, time on creating a product or good. And when a consumer or you throw away the scrap or that item itself, those emissions associated with the production of that good or service, they had no value. We just threw them away. So that waste, that product waste, the greenhouse gas emissions waste, it's just a symptom of upstream carbon inefficiency. It's really that simple. It's just it's a glaringly bad inefficiency. With treatment, those emissions have come from the act of doing something with the waste. So you're landfilling it, you're incinerating it, you're composting it. All of these things produce some form of greenhouse gas emissions. So landfills produce the most methane. We know that. Again, have the science, have the data. We've measured it. Check, check, check. Incineration, it still produces carbon dioxide. We know that. It's still not great. Regardless of the systems you have in place to capture these emissions, it still produces them, and you are still required to report on that. So, yes, there are things in place to be able to assist you in maybe trying to make those systems more efficient. But wouldn't the more efficient thing be to look at your production in the first place instead of trying to capture and chase the problem at the end? So that's really, you can reframe reporting as much as possible, but really what we need to be doing is reframing production and manufacturing. Now, how do we report on these things? There's a couple key things that you should probably understand. There's actual emissions, so that's what goes into the air. What emissions are going into the air? The physical things that went into the air. There's the scope 3 emissions, which is us counting those emissions. And there are very specific ways we have to count those emissions. And then there's avoided emissions. So say in the treatment you captured methane. That's great. That's just considered an avoided emission though. That's an emission that might have happened instead of what could have happened if you had done nothing. So if you decided you were going to take what you normally would landfill, and you are going to put it in, you're going to capture the methane from the landfill, that's just an avoided emission. It doesn't really benefit you much on emissions reporting. It's not a truly big and hugely meaningful thing. However, with that being said, it depends on the type of business that you have. So if you're a waste reporter, you're running landfills, that might be pretty meaningful, right? Than if you're just a company that only has 1 ton of waste a year. That's probably not going to be as impactful for your greenhouse gas emissions reporting as a company. So it really does depend on the type of reporting and the type of company that you are. So if you say, hey, I diverted waste and I avoided emissions, but you want to capture waste generated in business reporting activities, that's where it falls. And I have an example, which we can go to the next slide, of what this looks like. All right, so I hate this picture. That's why I put it on here. Why are we wrapping a pomegranate in plastic? It's just, oh goodness. So my example here is, if we recall scope 3 category 5, that's waste generated in operation. So we want to remember that this accounts for, like, it's not manufacturing, right? And we're looking at the tons of waste and the treatment method and material type. So we look at, when we talk about waste and we look at the whole big picture of scope 1, 2, and 3, waste on either side, upstream or downstream, is going to appear small depending upon what type of company you are. And in this case, it's going to appear small. That's okay. But this is because a lot of other categories account for other portions of the life cycle of the product or service. So for example, if our office buys food, we're going to account for that in our upstream category, or upstream scope 3. We throw it away. That's category 5. If we landfill, compost, or prevent it, that will all depend on how we account for those emissions. So landfill it, we're going to account for those emissions a specific way. Compost it, we'll count for less of those emissions. But if we prevented that altogether, not only did we reduce how much money we spent, we avoided upstream and downstream emissions, and also didn't have to pay a waste hauler. So bottom line, prevention is always best. So that's the most important takeaway for me. And now I'm going to hand it over to Sue. So Sue is, oh, wait, sorry, one more. Forgot about this one. So before I actually hand it over to Sue and introduce her, the 3 things that Sue's going to break things down are really broken down by opportunity, objective, and outcome. So when we take a look at any of these challenges, when we look at waste, we want to take a look at what's the opportunity. There's always going to be an opportunity for improvement, and we want to identify it. And the most important thing we want to do when we identify it is we want to benchmark it at the beginning. any good scientist or researcher knows you have to take a picture of something, benchmark it, gather the data before you begin. Then you want to outline what your objective is. What are we going to try to do here? And what do we hope to achieve? And then at the end, what's the outcome after you rolled out your project? And that's where the beginning data and the end data can show you the picture of whether or not what we did was actually meaningful and what we can try again. And honestly, it's about iteration and continual improvement. And this is where Sue is an absolute expert and measuring all of just not the impact of waste reduction, but also the associated emissions too. Sue's worked in the waste and sustainability industry for over 30 years. She's an expert in zero waste. I think she started when, you had to separate paper types by newspaper and colored paper and glossy paper. But she's supported Fortune 100 customers. She's done basic recycling programs, comprehensive zero waste solutions. She does waste analyses, building audits, but she's also a true zero waste consultant as well. If you know anything about Sue, you also know that she's a lover of all animals, domestic, exotic, and she's an excellent kayaker. So you can find her kayaking in her spare time. So Sue, you can take it away.
Thanks, Alex. Great information that you shared. And I'm going to try and give a more practical, project that we've done for a very large customer. And there's so many different levels to how and how and where you can separate things. And so this very large client in the Seattle, Washington area really is looking at eliminating their waste. They are a zero waste certified business since 2016, and they really have done a great job of looking beyond. How do I get rid of this? How do I handle this differently? And one of the things, especially around food waste, now at this facility, the local vendor, Cedar Grove, will accept food, paper products, napkins and paper towels, as well as compostable fiberware. And so those items are currently all getting recycled through the compost program. But even with the compost program, you are generating greenhouse gas emissions. And that's where Alex mentioned, scope 3, category 5. And so the thing that we started out talking about was how far away the compost yard was. That's where we started. Well, it's 73 miles times 2 is 145 miles. But you also have to take into account type of truck, engine type, types of fuel. Gosh, how good are the tires? There's so many variables. But as we started talking about it, we actually realized that we're taking 4 trips. They leave their yard, they come and pick up our compactor, they go back to their yard, they empty it, they come back to our site, drop off our empty, and then they return to their home base. That is 4 trips. Well, now every trip is 300 miles instead of 150. And we might have 4, sometimes 6 compactors leaving the site in a day. So that's where we started working on things and really looking at, number one, what is the quality of the material that we're generating? What are the offsets? Because even through a compost program, they are using water and energy. Now, the EPA wants job of identifying, where you can take things. And when you look at even landfill to compost, they're similar in greenhouse gas emissions, not quite all the way, because it depends on the landfill, and there's variables for every layer of this. And I have not gone into that level of detail in here, but I wanted to talk through them so that as you plan things out, you're going to be able to identify what happens. So if it goes into a regular landfill and it's covered every day, depending on what state you're in, most are required to do daily landfill cover, and then they re-uncover it and they put more material in. But as Alex mentioned, there's a plastic liner basically that stops anything leaking into the ground. And some of these landfills are so incredibly old that they do not have that, which is ghastly, honestly. But I think it's important to realize just how many different layers and the directions you can go for this. So we did a case study. We worked on the opportunity to evaluate not only what we're doing with the material, how we're handling it, what it does, but also look at the objectives. So we are using electricity on this machine, and we're even looking at possibly adding solar to it. This is a biodigester. It's through HARP. They have a good machine. And there's plenty of machines that exist as a biodigester. You feed the material in. This one actually has a grinder on it and drops it in. And then you're using enzymes and heat and the movement of those enzymes. And then you get a dirt byproduct, which I showed on the previous stream. This facility generates a phenomenal volume of material, as you can see, that we're estimating 7.6 million pounds of waste, food waste, a year. Daily, we're generating 30,000 pounds of food waste. We're looking at using EV equipment to move the material around so that we're offsetting some of the different parts and pieces to the scope 3 that we're generating. This request came from the customer of what are our options with our compost vendor. And this client very much worries about perception. They worry about the fact that you can claim that there's contamination, but is there really? And we've actually done a load before it was going in to be audited by the compost vendor. And we did an waste audit of it, and had a percentage. We knew that it was less than 3% contamination, and they came back to us and said it was 12%. We're like, how? Here's all of our facts. Show us your facts. And so it really was a concern from our client about how the vendor required things. The other thing that happened out of Seattle is that they became, I'm going to call it the seller of the compostable utensils. And we were like, there's a conflict of interest here that you're telling us that we must use only yours, but that's all they would accept. We also did a conversation and documentation and reporting of what SBM actually was recommending and why. Well, that means that as SBM and the expert in this, we had to know what the equipment was doing, know what the vendor was doing, and look at different ways to perfect the process. Now, this is a different machine. It's a BioCotec. And the perception on this dock in a parking garage is that it had a smell. So that's when we went and did research on other pieces of equipment. The CO2 and gases that come out of this, you can see that this is completely sealed. The only thing that comes out on this bottom end is it's got a turning mechanism that pulls the finished products out. If I put 10 pounds in one of these machines, we're getting about 2 pounds out. So approximately 80% of the material is being, I'm going to call it cooked, and comes out a smaller, finer product that we can reuse on site. So our research options really looked at the quantifying the volumes and how the end product looks when it's done. And again, we're trying to eliminate the driving as well as all of the greenhouse gas emissions that come out of a compost program. And there are some compost programs. I'm going to use South San Francisco. I want to say it's Scavenger. Their process actually is using a machine that captures most of the gas and reuses it in a truck. So you've got to be researching everything, every part of this to know how all the numbers align. And I can't stress that enough as we go through here. But, as you work through the process and you're looking at biodigesters as an example, you have to know what they will accept. You also have to know if they're going to add water to the process, a lot of water, and then they're pushing it down the sewer system, because those exist. Well, now you're changing the greenhouse gas emissions that come from pumping water to whether or not you're putting it into a machine and you can reuse that product on site. So as you look at that equipment, not only do you want to talk to people and view them, but you physically want to go on a site and see what they're like. Our big push was about the seals and smells. because you can't have it smelling like a compost yard when it's a business. And then you've got to establish what are the pilots and what are the different guidelines behind it. Now, this is a pretty clean, sorted material that is all the compostables, right? Napkins, compostable fiberware. This machine and this program allows bioplastics and bioplastic lids. So everything, this is a compostable straw. Everything on site is a compostable item, which makes it a lot easier for us to know that if it is on site, even tea bags, they are compostable. Now, as long as you don't have, our biggest contamination on this facility is aluminum cans in the compost, which we are trying to fix. But, it's just very important to look at not only what you're putting into compost, but also the percentage of compost that is still going into the landfill. You really have two different markets going on. Hopefully a clean-ish compostable product, but also what am I still putting in the landfill that is creating more greenhouse gas than even if I put it into a compost program. So those are things that on the different end of the scope, we're working on for education. So I mentioned we looked at equipment, we looked at smells, then we had to look at ventilation, because you've got to look at where these machines get placed or where you're storing and moving your compost. There's got to be some form of ventilation, as well as you also have to plan for movement on site. I mentioned we generate 30,000 pounds of compost a day. How do you move that to one place or multiple places? It all has to be evaluated. And then the last part of this is really knowing what the composter program is, and am I creating more greenhouse gas or less? When we got to the very end of the pilot and actually met with the client, we were able to include the greenhouse gas as part of their decision-making skills, because this is intended to be a negative net zero greenhouse gas emissions site. So it's just looking at the different ways that we put things together and whether it was a true statement or a false statement. Unless the system you send to compost captures all your greenhouse gas, you have to be incorporating this plus the vehicle movement. So one of the things that we did is we looked at the potential impacts and benefits. I've mentioned this, and it supports their zero waste 2030 goal. When we align the final presentation on what we're trying to communicate, where are they going to ask questions? I'm a firm believer that I'm going to try and poke as many holes in my thought process to eliminate them poking holes in it. I want to answer their questions before they basically ask them. And so we looked at, where is it going? What commercial fertilizer will it be made into? Can it be reused on site if I bring a biodigester in? We used Midwest labs to actually test our output products on whether it was a compost, whether it was a mulch, how it had to be used. And then we shared that with the landscape company, because in all the planning, we had to work with the landscape team to identify how much volume we would be giving them, how they had to mix this product with mulch, because this is very fertilizer heavy. So we didn't want to burn plants. So all of the thinking is beyond just that I'm trying to get away from using my compost program. And then what we did is we really had to look at the math. And one of the things that we did, this is a very large facility. It is, we use Copilot. And I actually asked before we started documenting everything if we were counting on the numbers from Copilot to be accurate. And because this facility is the owner of Copilot, they agreed to everything. So we ran this through Copilot to give us very detailed direction. And I kept everything separate so that I could learn from it. And it even gave us an output that biodigesters are a net greenhouse gas negative, which prevents more emissions than they do produce. So you're looking at, what types of equipment The other thing that I would do, and I'm still waiting for the customer to have funding to go forward with this project, but my next step, if I hear that, is to look at the different AI technologies and see how similar they're going to be in the math. Because I don't want one to say this is good and one to say this is bad, but we haven't gone to that level yet. And so this case study was truly an opportunity to look beyond just using the waste hauler. We have most, not all, but almost most of our material goes into a compactor and is moved. We have a few locations that are outside our cluster of clients that are using front end loaders. So that was a little bit different math, but it was a small percentage. In addition, I mentioned that we looked at the equipment eliminating or something else. We have not found a something else that works really well. I'm always looking at, there's a lot of equipment that exists that cafeteria companies use, but they put it in the kitchen. Well, they're adding water to the mix. When you add water to the mix with food, or you pulp it, or you try and, squeeze it out, but then you add it to the water to run it through your sewer system, now we're creating a problem with the city's program. So you've got to be looking at the whole start to finish, that entire life cycle assessment of what you're generating and where you're going to take this, because you don't want to create a bigger problem on the other end. And so I mentioned we still have a pilot. We finished our pilot with the biodigester. We got all the information we needed. This material was presented to the client facilities team. We then, the next step, ended up being meeting with the sustainability team on site and comparing both the physical part of things from the facilities side of things to also the sustainability team looking at the greenhouse gas reductions. We did set it up for a 3-year ROI and included the labor that was involved, as well as confirming the greenhouse gas savings. So in conclusion, I can't stress the importance of waste is just multifaceted. There's so many levels of it that comes through the building. And Alex did a great job of starting out with, you've got to reduce it. You got to work with the cafeteria teams to not throw so much food away and to not put so much heavy food onto a plate that people just don't finish eating. The other part of this is educating people to put things in the right place. We still have not gone and looked at the landfill and all the problems that exist of compost going into landfill. But we have looked at what we're doing with compost and how we're managing it. And that education part of things for employees, that has been our biggest opportunity to work with. Just this Earth Day, we focused on getting aluminum cans out of compost. We don't know why people are doing that, but they are. So with that, we wanted to see what kind of questions you might have, and I'm going to stop sharing. So,
excellent. Thank you. We do have a few questions that came in the chat. Alex, I know you answered one of them that came in from Laura regarding the best practices related to carbon accounting for reuse efforts, but I'd like to give you an opportunity to answer that for everyone here.
Yeah, so the question was just about reuse efforts, and the challenge with reuse is that it's just considered avoided emissions. So avoided emissions are tricky because there's no exact way of saying, I avoided these emissions and therefore they equate to this number, and I can then I can subtract it from my overall scope 3 emissions. You actually can't do that. That's not allowed. So avoided emissions, you have to say maybe in a narrative or where you're describing your corporate carbon footprint or your greenhouse gas inventory. That's where you say, we track the number of items we reused. We track the weight or volume of what those products were. And then we associate those emissions by weight, by volume, by product, by avoided purchase as to be such. And that's where you really clearly state your assumptions. And that's where, when you write that narrative out, if you were to go and get any sort of audit done for your greenhouse gas inventory, that the auditor can see, oh, okay, that's where those assumptions came from. and it's never going to be a bad thing. I think a lot of times we get really hung up on only looking at the total greenhouse gas emissions, but avoided emissions still have meaning. We just haven't found a really good way of saying, hey, these still count. We just don't know how to put that in paper. You know what I mean? Like we don't know how to make that meaningful. And a lot of times too, you'll see some companies kind of take advantage of that, and they'll use that to their, to their advantage a little too far. That's also where like Sue and her team, what they do when they go out to different companies and they
Alex, you locked up. I'm going to add
audits,
that.
when they do waste audits, hold on.
Nope, go ahead.
There we go. Is that better?
I think so.
Okay. So when Sue's team goes out, they have an entire sheet, and that sheet includes things like items that were reused or things that weren't produced year over year. And when you start to build that and you track it year over year, you can see the impact of that. And so that's where you get that story. That's why, if you look at the Science-Based Target Initiative, it requires 2 years of corporate data. And that's not only because for data quality purposes, but also to make sure that when we're looking at this, we can see an actual impact year over year of what you're doing. And that's where reuse and the weight of reuse or prevented purchases becomes more and more meaningful.
I'm going to add to that if you're tracking your solid waste, and depending on your vendor, you've got to confirm this. I'm going to use an aluminum can. So the EPA WARM model will take that if that recycled can is recycled, it's got paths that say if it came from, we ordered the aluminum and we drove it to so-and-so, the EPA went and did the math that when you're doing your solid waste report, it'll show you a potential greenhouse gas savings, but you don't get to claim it when you're actually doing a scope 3 reporting or inventory on that. So 2 different things.
Great. We have a couple of other questions in the Q&A. Can you comment on composting tea bags? You mentioned that in the case study, they are accepted, but knowing that many tea bags have plastics in their bag makeup, can you comment on that? And then the question is there a way to tell if it's a natural product or if there's plastic in the tea bag itself?
At this facility, this customer actually buys and only buys compostable items. Even a tea bag, a Lipton tea bag is paper, and it's a cotton-based item that can easily be recycled. There are some that have a foil package that is not recyclable or compostable. There are also nylon ones that are not compostable. So I'm talking more business, but that business will look at what they can buy, especially the cafeteria team. And they have worked with, especially at our site, they have worked with this site to establish it has to be compostable. No foil on the inside, no nylon. Even the string sometimes is nylon, and you can't do that. It won't break down.
So is there a way to tell?
Well, yes, if you can't tear it, you can tear a tea bag, you cannot tear the nylon tea bags. When you tear open the actual package and you see foil on the inside, that is not compostable. Good question.
Great. An additional question, what software do you recommend for calculating waste-based emissions, not just in composting versus recycling, but also avoidance, reduction, and reuse?
I have not found anything that I like.
Same.
Yeah, it's not thorough, it's not consistent. And so what I've been doing, I use compost as an example. Are you going to track most of the time? And I'm going to go back 5+ years. We've been tracking mileage on trucks. So the truck to the landfill, the truck to recycle, and even the trucks to compost. because we have not claimed what we're putting into a landfill, except for when you look at the Scope 3 emissions that Alex has been working on, right? That's her. And I got onto a call and I'm like, time out. You can't charge me for a case of toilet paper that was used. And because of the way their math works, you still get charged with a case of toilet paper. That goes down the toilet, and we're the ones buying it. She's laughing. We're the ones buying it for our customers because we're a janitorial company. Well, that means that the way their system is set up, which is poorly set up, I might add, we pay for it and we get charged for the toilet paper that we buy, as well as the toilet paper as waste. And then let's say there's an IFM, JLL, CBRE, Cushman & Wakefield, any of them, they also should be claiming it because they're buying that material from us. And then on top of that is a third direction. The client pays the bill from JLL or CBRE or whomever, and now they're getting charged 3 times for the purchase of toilet paper and the waste of toilet paper, which is the silliest thing I've ever seen. And I will fight to the end. Anyway, there is no software that we found. It's somebody manually putting it in Excel, and you've got to be able to check the numbers.
Yeah. I'm going to, excuse me, I'm going to turn off my video because I don't know what my internet's doing, but I'm going to answer that a little bit more. So with software, what you're going to find is that there's no one-stop solution because everybody is trying to flood the market with some sort of software solution that is made for all of scope 1, 2, and 3. So what they're doing is because they're trying to satisfy everything, there's nothing that's really, really good at doing one thing well. So for someone like SBM that is a service provider, we don't manufacture any goods. There's no real tool or assessment module or even spreadsheet that you're able to purchase out there that is truly applicable to us as a business. And even when we work with consultants on the more complex parts of our greenhouse gas emissions calculations, they struggle to find greenhouse gas protocol rules and guidance that are appropriate for our business. So the problem with calculating waste and composting, avoiding, reduction, any of that, it's really going to be based off of this idea of best practices rather than a tool. And that's where that idea of a narrative becomes so important because you have to explain what you're doing. And there's no tool out there that does that. And that's where you can it can get sticky too, because people are assuming that this is going to be fine. It's going to work well. But it doesn't account or properly represent what your company or your efforts are actually, doing really. And that's one of my biggest pet peeves. But to Sue's point, yes, there's a lot of double counting in greenhouse gas emissions. And the hope is that through scope 3, every single person who has their hand in the pot will take accountability for what they're doing. That's the hope.
That's all the questions I see in the Q&A. I apologize for the snafu on the functionality of the chat. But if you do have further comments or questions and you're open to having your audio turned on, if you just send us a message through the QA, I can activate you that way. And while we wait to see if anyone wants to join us that way, I just want to say thank you so much for such a clear presentation on the scope 3 emissions and the great case study. And thank you for joining us here today. Any further comments from Alex or Sue before we depart?
Thank you for the opportunity, Jill. I think it's important to realize that waste needs to be included. Everybody focuses on energy and water, and I think that's a mistake because they don't prioritize waste, and I think it's something that can be not easily fixed, but definitely tracked and established to be a good method. and to share best in class processes and direction.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. Well, you're preaching to the choir here.
Yes. And probably most people on the call. Excellent.
Great. Well, thank you. And thanks to everyone who took time out of their day to join us today. We will be sharing the slide deck afterwards and a recording for those that registered and were not able to join us live. So thank you, and we'll let you get back to your the rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.